Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for our second Enterprise Insights webinar. I'm joined today by my colleague Jasmine Nuthall, who is a director within our Enterprise Advisory Group. And we will be speaking to you today on a number of factors. But before we get started, I just want to remind everybody of the different things. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see the option to ask questions. If you have questions throughout the webinar, please ensure that you're typing those in there. We will be monitoring those and then addressing them at the end of the webinar. Additionally, as a NASBA accredited sponsor, we're able to offer the continuing professional education credits. So for today's webinar, in order to qualify, you need to answer all 3 polling questions that we're going to have throughout the webinar, and they'll be appearing at different points within the webinar. So please ensure that you answer those polling questions for the CPE. They'll pop out at various times, and stay tuned and make sure you answer each one. We'll give about a minute per each one. And at the end of the webinar, we're going to be circulating a survey. We do please ask that you complete that survey and provide us with feedback, as we do use that feedback for ways that we can be better, as well as future subject matters that you wish to hear within our webinar series that we have for this, and our tax webinar series that we have. Additionally, we have the closed captioning transcript. So if you'd like to have the words appear at the bottom, you'll see the live transcript. If you click that, you will see the words at the same time as hearing us. And so let's get rolling. Throughout our webinar today, we're going to be touching on a few different areas with regards to administrative debt. And really, first we're going to define what is administrative debt anyways. A lot of times it's a fairly overlooked thing that a lot of organizations tend to have, especially as they're scaling up. And we're going to discuss how to look at those symptoms early in order to catch them, so that it doesn't snowball to a place where it's very hard to undo once you get systems in place. We're also going to spend some time just discussing how you can quantify the cost of that administrative debt. And really, the intent of that is to improve profits. A lot of time our overheads can get carried away, and in order to improve our profits, we also need to ensure that we're doing things that add value, and that our people are doing things that add value to the organization. And in general, we start with process mapping. And Jasmine will talk briefly what it means to process map, what are the steps that need to be undertaken at high level, and what the importance of that is. And then finally, we'll spend a little bit of time about what are some automated solutions, and what should you automate and what you shouldn't automate, because there is different things that you need to take into account when you're looking at automating stuff, and it's not always the right answer. Often there is a lot of things that you can automate, but you need to be really careful. And one of the examples you think about is when you phone a large organization and they have the automation and the AI that answers the phone, and you're sitting there yelling at the phone saying, "Let me talk to a person." That's, keep in your mind those things, that when you're automating something, are you really saving time for your customers and or yourself as an organization and the people that you have. And so we'll dive right in, and Jasmine and I will, go through everything. I'll start off just trying to giving an explanation of what exactly is administrative debt. And, it's not necessarily a term that's used widely within the different things. However, it is something that it's actually extremely important when you're growing an organization to continue to look at it. And generally, administrative debt starts to brew, and it's usually built in a place of, as you're scaling up an organization, you're consistently adding new steps, new processes to mitigate risk and to ensure that things are being done. And what tends to happen with the legacy structures is something will happen and you'll add another step, and then you'll add another step, and you'll add another step. And before you know it, you have so many steps within the process that it really hinders the amount of overhead that you have, because you're spending so much time thinking about things and approving things, and not really recognizing what is the risk of this, and how is there a point in having that situation. And really, when you start to get to that point of adding additional steps, and it usually comes from a place because something has happened and you're like, oh, we better add this step in to protect ourselves from this never happening again. And instead of somewhat stepping back and going, okay, that happened, What's the risk if it happens again? Do we need to add more steps? And by adding all these steps, it actually risks the company's situation in being able to adapt. And it can also hinder the organizational performance because you're now so rigid, if you will, in the way that you're trying to process items that you can't really think about outside the box. And a lot of times we'll talk about this throughout the webinar, but you also hear people say, well, that's how we've always done it. And instead of stepping back and going, is that actually how we should be doing it? And usually the way that you do, you can come up with your administrative debt is looking at your outdated policies, trying to decide, are these applicable anymore for who we are today? Is there a hierarchy? How many people are approving things? If you have 4 or 5 people approving things, why? Why does it have to go through so many different steps versus 2 or 3? High risk things sometimes generally need that, but there's a lot of things within an organization that probably don't need that. And, it can be things about safety, finances. Those generally are a little bit more higher risk. So there are things that need to be put in place. There's regulations that need to be followed that if you don't follow regulations, however, like I said, if you have 5 people looking at it, does it make sense for 5 people to be looking at it? Because that does, in essence, cost the organization money. And you're always looking at that risk reward when you're trying to figure out, is it worth spending that money? And then also just the knowledge, trying to understand the depth of knowledge that you have within your organization and whether or not it's adding value to the end decision. When we think about what are some common causes that exist within administrative debt, a lot of times it starts to happen because we're so focused on today and focused on what's happening in the now. And when you're looking at problems that exist just in front of you versus what does this problem look like 5 years from now, that's where you start to create those layers of approval processes. And that's where you start to run into the risk of creating additional administrative debt within your organization. The other thing that has, and we see this actually quite often, is when you grow really fast. When an organization grows really fast, they're constantly reacting to that problem in front of them and adding things and adding things and adding things. And at some point, we'll talk about you have to step back and you have to go, okay, the stuff that I've added, is this adding value? Is this bringing anything to my organization? Because maybe you needed to hire another person to do that work. And when you say, okay, why am I hiring that person and what are they doing? And do we really need to be doing that? And generally, when you have a very high paced growth situation within an organization, you just keep adding and adding and adding and adding versus stepping back and saying, why are we adding this? What value is it going to bring to the organization? And the only way you can do that is determining what, and Jasmine will talk about this in a little bit, talking about what is your actual vision versus reacting to the problem right in front of you and adding people and adding processes and adding steps. What is it you're really trying to achieve? And it is very difficult in a high-paced growth company to do that, to step back and go, why am I doing this? The other thing is, sometimes leadership focuses a little bit too much on operations. It's very common, especially in founder organizations, where someone comes in and says, you're not screwing that bolt right. Does the leader, does the CEO really need to be doing that conversation? And that actually adds to administrative debt and will reduce your profits over time if you don't have the right people doing the right thing and having the right amount of hierarchy and approvals to make sure something's happening. Because every time you insert a layer, just think of it as costing your company money. And when you cost your company money, you're going to increase your administrative debt. And that's how we generally look at it. The other thing is systems optimize for cost and not scalability. And at the end of the webinar, we are going to go into the automation as I discussed a little bit. What sometimes happens is you put systems in place for today, and it works great. I generally, when I'm talking with my clientele, I say, is this system going to be a system that you're going to use for the next 5 years? And if the answer is yes, then okay. However, if it's a system that, given the pace that you're growing, given the pace that you're coming into your situation, or coming into your organization, sorry, is that system still going to exist in 5 years? And if the answer is no, the question you need to be asking yourself is, why are we doing it? Because you're implementing something that's going to take time, it's going to take resources, and all of that adds to your administrative debt. And the other thing is just everybody moving so fast, no one talks. Collaboration within an organization is so key and so important. When you have multiple divisions walking their own lanes, and leadership of each of those divisions walking their own lanes and not talking to each other and not sharing information, you might end up in a situation where you have multiple systems doing the same thing because each division has decided they want to do something. And instead of talking to each other, and you're paying for multiple licenses, you're paying for multiple implementation, training of systems, that all is going to add to the different administrative debt that starts to accumulate within an organization, reducing your profit. And so it's very important when you're stepping into these situations and looking at your process mapping and trying to step back and go, what's caused where we are today? And I've seen it even within our entity. When you grow really fast, you just start adding layers. And when you just start adding layers and never kind of step back and go, why do those layers exist? And are they important? And are they going to help us with our future vision? You have to really consider, why are we doing it? And is it important? You have anything else to add with that, Jasmine?
I do want to go back to one of the points on the knowledge, the tribal knowledge. So that is also one of the common causes is as you're growing, information is maintained within one or two or a select group of individuals. And what that does is it creates a void if those individuals leave. So without having your processes documented and only held by key individuals, I've seen that as well. When these key individuals leave the organization is actually stuck. They're unable to move forward because they don't know what was done or how it was done.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that, that can, i- and it might not even be someone leaves. Life happens, right? And
Mm.
you put yourself at risk when you have too much housed in a brain versus in a system, in a process. Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to hop to our first polling question. And the question is, which of the following do you believe is the most common cause of administrative debt in your organization? Outdated process and policies, leadership focused on daily operations, over complex approval systems, manual workarounds, and lack of automation. I think at the end of the day, some people could say all of these. I think there's I've definitely seen it exist within a lot of enterprises. However, some people might say that it exists in different places.
But I'd be curious as to what is the most common in your organization. So, out of the people attending today, um, now that you know a bit more about what administrative debt is, what do you feel is the most common cause in the organization that you're representing today?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, see, just as we suspected, it's all over the map. It's a little bit of everything that kicks in for these. But I would say the highest one, and as I said, leadership focused on daily operations. That really can create roadblocks, not just in administrative debt, but it actually can create roadblocks in growth for the organization because leadership's not focusing on how to grow or how to create a vision. It's a double whammy.
And when your leadership is focused on your daily operations and you don't have automation, how much time are you losing for moving initiatives forward or capitalizing on that first to market approach for either a service or a product?
Exactly. So you want to speak to some common symptoms, Jasmine?
Absolutely. When we talk about administrative debt, we've identified that leadership is too involved in the operations. That does lead to decision-making processes are slow. When you have to go through multiple layers to, say, buy this particular widget, it creates, again, that barriers to growth because no one can actually move forward on an initiative. The excessive sign-offs multiple people. So, for example, if you have um, an executive member must sign off before making a purchase. When you buy the purchase, then they have to sign off on the actual payment. So they've, in essence, touched this transaction more than one time. And how many times in the organizations do we see that where there's this focus on control, which also creates a barrier to moving items forward. And then you have your siloed work units. This is where that tribal knowledge comes into play. When you have siloed work units, you have, again, those individuals who hold parts of information of the organization, and that compounds and slows growth as well. There is much to say with diversity of thought at the table. When you only have one part of the process, or the system as a whole, you're only seeing one part of it. When you allow others to come in and you share information, it creates better thoughts, better idea generation, and greater innovation. The reliance of manual workarounds. There's a huge resistance almost to automating. And I think that's actually through fear. Individuals are fearful of AI, fearful of what happens to my role if I'm no longer touching this transaction. And there's a lot of opportunities there to focus on strategy and focus on adding value in different ways.
Yeah, I think, the other thing about the automation, sometimes what happens is people automate all their processes without saying, do we
Why?
actually need to do this process? And I have seen that a lot as well, is they've spent so much time just trying to continue to do everything that they've done and automate it versus going, do we actually need to do this?
And that's a good question. That will lead into our discussion on process mapping. That's one of the key items. Does this actually need to be done? And you might be automating a process that doesn't even need to happen anymore. Either you're not big enough or you're too big to actually even worry about that specific item. There's staff frustrations with administrative bottlenecks. I have also seen organizations where team members are actually unable to go and take a client out for lunch without getting 2 or 3 levels of approval. And again, that hinders your growth. You are no longer able to actively represent your organization within the ecosystem. And I think that there's many examples of administrative bottlenecks. It can generally be with, in my experience, generally with hospitality expenses, expense claims getting paid, as well as moving simple decisions forward. And a lot of times, what I hear when I go into organizations, when I ask, why are you doing these? What I get is, this is how we do it. This is the way we've always done it, and this is the way we do it now. And there isn't a real understanding of the why. And that's where, again, that process mapping is critical. Next slide, please. So, some of the consequences of the ignored symptoms. We've talked about this a lot. There's increased operational costs, high employee frustration. Um, when your employees can't move items forward, they sit at their desk. That costs money. They become bored. They'll start looking for a new role. We all show up to work with the inherent need to add value. We all want to know that we are creating value and that we're adding value to the organizations or communities that we serve. This can also lead to negatively impact our client satisfaction. If we can't move an item forward, and let's say we're in the service industry, we're actually unable to meet the demands of our client, which again leads to employee frustration. There's increased risk exposure to the organization. What that means is poor documentation and unclear workflows raise the risk of compliance, failures, financial errors, and potentially can also increase the likelihood of misappropriation of funds within an organization. When your processes are not clearly documented, there are loopholes or ways for individuals to maneuver through the system, and it actually also impacts your internal control framework. And there's missed strategic opportunities. When you're focused on getting 5 levels of signatures on a transaction, you're not actually focused on that strategic growth or pursuing that strategic client is going to help you achieve your growth outcomes and really help you get into the markets that you want to penetrate.
Yeah, I think, at the end of the day, with the ignored symptoms, if you think about the worst case scenario, you have increased costs, low retention of employees, and customers are angry. Like that is a recipe for disaster within any organization in the worst case scenario. And when you're really trying, and like you said, you'll talk about it in the processing mapping, when you're really trying to understand the why of something, you also have to understand if we continue to do this, how's it hindering us? Not just if we stop doing this, how's that going to benefit us? It's how, if we continue to do it, how is it going to hinder us?
Absolutely. It's not just about starting stuff. It's also about stopping stuff as
That's
well.
right. Yeah, exactly.
So, quantifying the cost of administrative debt, everybody can actually do that in your own organizations. You can allocate your direct costs. So, as you're process mapping a process through, you can determine how much time does it take to to complete this process, complete this transaction. You can look at your wages, you can look at your materials, licenses. Those are very easy to measure in an organization, and when I'm process mapping for organizations, we can generally allocate the time and then you put the salaries to it. And it's very eye-opening for organizations when they see that, say, this $1,200 item actually costs the organization over $2,500 to process. And it really changes the mindset and it changes the perspective of your processes and of how you move items and transactions through the organization. Of course, one of the harder items to quantify is your missed opportunities as well as your reduced customer satisfaction. It's also really important for organizations to have a form of measuring on these items. What is that sale you didn't make? So what does that actually cost you?
Yeah. It's the old thing that we started off with is when leadership being involved in too many things. If leadership is so involved in operations and in ensuring that their overhead and administration is being managed, what are you doing to help foster the future vision of your organization? What's the strategy of the organization? As a leader, that's important that you own that title, you own that role. And if you're so busy kind of in the weeds with everything, where are we actually spending the energy to continue the growth? And you talked about, it was interesting your comment about the salaries and how you have to quantify that. And it's hard to quantify the indirect costs for sure, but it is often sometimes something that is so abstract for people to see that they just are like, I just need to hire somebody else to do the job, right? Versus, I'll give an example. For instance, there was a process mapping done where there was a department that had 4 employees when we first started, and we went through the process mapping. We continued to look at what was important, what wasn't important, what could be automated, what needed to be done. And at the end of the day, we realized we actually didn't need 4 people to do that job. We only needed maybe 1.5, maybe, to do the job, because there was a lot of steps within what was being done that actually added no value to the whole system and the whole process. And when you really start to step back, that costs us money, even though it was an employee, which is hard to sometimes understand that side of things, because it's not, you're not buying a widget, you're not buying something tangible. It's somewhat intangible because you have to be abstract in the way you're quantifying it. But when you don't step back and do that, you have to wonder where is every value being added within the organization for that future vision. And that's really what you have to continually step back. You said, Jasmine, the why, right? So you have to constantly step back and revisit that why.
And there is a tool that you can use, and I think it goes a step beyond asking the why. Sometimes you get to a point when you've process mapped out and you have all these steps and all these items that are being done by multiple individuals. It's also stepping back and having the individual's question, are you doing this because this fits the vision for yourself, or does it fit the vision of the organization? There are those two items that also need to be looked at, because sometimes individuals are performing a task and utilizing their time for something that, because we have always done it this way and I don't want to lose my job, as opposed to, is this truly best for the organization? Is this time, am I spending time on something that is meeting that strategic vision for the organization? And it goes back to having leadership step out of the daily operations and focus on that vision. Without a clear vision, your team actually can't even do that, because they need to understand what the vision of the organization is. And that's actually how organization or administrative debt compounds.
Yeah.
It starts off with these little items and then it snowballs. And without that unified vision, you have no growth.
And you see it, especially in scale up. You think about all the startups that exist, and they start with an idea, and the idea starts to grow. And I talked about it at the back, fast-paced growth. If you're a startup that grows like this, you're just adding, and you're not stepping back and going, why am I adding all these things? Or what do I need to take out because I've added this? You think about when I go clothes shopping. If I want to buy something new, something else has to come out of my closet, because my closet can fit only so many clothes. There should be only so many processes. So if you're adding something, where are you going to remove so that you're not continuing to add in there? That's kind of in my brain. That's how I liken it to. Should we go to the next polling question?
We should go to the next polling question.
All right.
So, which of the following is considered an indirect cost of administrative debt? Staff salaries spent on manual workarounds, software licensing fees, reduced customer satisfaction, or time spent completing required approvals. This is really interesting. This is testing whether or not people are paying attention.
That's right. I think if we were to go to that, the indirect cost of administrative debt, you really have to kind of step out and be abstract in your thinking when you're going through this process, because I go back to that when you're phoning, and if you're getting an automated and you just can't get your answer, it's very, I mean, my other thing is I travel a lot, and the airports are all moving to the automatic scanners to save on human capital. But now they need double the amount of people checking bags, because the human capital, the AI scanner or the automated scanner isn't catching things, right? So they really saved? All right, Jasmine, here's your results.
Okay. We indirect costs, 100%, reduced customer satisfaction.
Yeah,
Um,
the other ones are more direct, because even though they're indirect in the sense that the person might be doing multiple things, it is still a direct expense of the company that's causing it. And that's what you're looking at.
you can allocate it to
That's
something
right.
specific. Your indirect costs, such as your reduced customer satisfaction, how do you measure that? And it's very difficult to see. And the one consequence of your indirect costs is you're not going to realize, it won't have the same real time reporting that you can get out of your staff salaries, out of your time spent and your licensing costs. Your customers, the decreased customer satisfaction, you probably won't see the impact of that for a number of quarters, possibly a year. And so it's very much a lagging indicator, and it is really important that organizations have the finger of the pulse of their clientele and understand the relationship between what they're doing and their client satisfaction. Because again, that is definitely a lagging indicator. And unfortunately, by the time you realize that you have lost those customers, and gaining new customer or regaining customers' trust is more difficult than attracting new clients.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So the importance of process mapping. So process mapping is one of the items that I rely on frequently. It helps clarify workflows. It helps identify inefficiencies. It helps improve communication and it supports better decision making. So process mapping as a whole allows you to see what you're doing, not the documented processes. And that's really important as you're looking at your operational optimization and helping get rid of that administrative debt, because sometimes you could have very well defined processes, but if no one's following them, you don't actually know where your costs are being incurred. And that is one of the most important parts of process mapping, is understanding who touches what in the transaction life cycle and when, and how much time are they spending. It is also beneficial to understand the time spent on each of those different items, as well as where are you using automation, where is it manual, and asking yourself along the way, is this adding value? Is this necessary? Do I need this to help the organization reach its goals, both short term and long term?
Yeah. I think the other thing with process mapping is we often hear, well, we don't really have time to do this. It's low priority.
Mhm.
And I often say to organizations, you actually don't have time not to do this. Because if you don't every once in a while step back and review what you've done over the year, what you've implemented, what you've taken away in your different processes. The initial setup is very time intensive, 100%. It's going to take time to go through the different departments, go through the different steps, interviewing the people, etc. It's going to take time. Once you have it in place, though, it's a revisit. And once you get to the revisit stage, it's not as important, but it is just as important to revisit it consistently.
Well, is the critical path that you chose when you first did it still the critical path? What has changed in your environment? And although this isn't necessarily part of process mapping, by the time you relook at your processes, doing that environmental scan helps inform what the critical path is, helps also inform, is this direction that we picked a year ago still the right direction for us?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's important through everything. Internal processes as well as client-facing processes.
And it also creates a shared language around the team. Everybody is now understanding what the terminology means. And we talked a bit about it, about the siloed work units. Generally, when you have siloed work units, you actually have a different communication and different language that is utilized by each team, and it doesn't always translate to the other teams. So, although they may be communicating to one another, if they're using a different language, it loses the impact and it loses the effectiveness. With process mapping, everybody is on the same page, everybody fully understands the same language, and they all get the same communication. Steps for process mapping. We've chatted a bit about this. Identify, prioritize what you want to look at. Where's the highest risk to your organization? Sometimes it's going to be expense claims, credit card claims, or it could be contracts. It could also be, say, installation of your product. It's very sector specific. It's also specific on what you're doing, what your client base is, and what your product is.
The
You
other
also
thing you
want to
can do, sorry, the other thing you can do when trying to determine the prioritization is really review your financial statements, right? Are there certain things that have really ballooned in cost comparative to other things? Like you said, it might be the installation if you're a service industry. If your installation costs have severely ballooned, what has happened? Maybe it's increases in wages, or it could be processes. But if you don't kind of step back and really review that financial data to understand what areas you should be spending your time on, because you do have to pick your prioritizations.
Yeah, and if you're having a lot of returns, you're having a lot of deficiencies, you probably want to focus on that area first because, again, it costs more to get a client back than it does to get a new one, and it costs even less to retain your existing client base. So you want to gather your data on the current practices. We chatted a bit about this. You want to take what is currently done, not what is written. What is written does not allow you to look at the critical path. You want to outline each step of the process to create an organized map of the workflow. I prefer to use software to do this. I find the waterfall clearly identifies each different unit and when they touch it. Generally, I'm looking at the transactions, who touches this when, and the different layers of the organization. Either it's business units or it is the hierarchical. How many times does a manager, director, or your analyst touch this particular item, and where does it go, and when do they touch it? One of the important part about this is, again, going back to that, what is the value? Why are we doing this particular step? And if the answer is because we've always done it, most times you can just scrap it and nobody will even notice. And
Hmm.
it's important to involve your stakeholders throughout the entire process and with the overall idea generation of what the critical path is for that particular process. And that goes back to sort of a change management. We all want to be part, we all want to have our voices heard, just like we all want to add value and we want to be valued. We also bring a level of experience as well as perspective that others don't have. And diversity of thought at the table when you're doing process mapping is very important, especially if you have had an increase in your overhead costs or you've had high amounts of deficiencies with your installations. You need to understand the why behind it, as well as identify the critical path. What is going to help the organization fix it?
Yeah, and who would you say are the main stakeholders that generally should be included other than employees? Is there anybody else?
When you're looking at your process mapping, it all depends on what the particular process is. I would have to say the individuals actually doing the work are probably your most important stakeholder when you're doing your process mapping. Of course, you're going to involve other stakeholders depending on, like, within the process, but to really understand that critical path, it's the individuals who are actually doing the task at hand,
Hmm.
because they're going to have information that won't be written. They'll have that tribal knowledge. Essentially, process mapping is getting that tribal knowledge onto a document that can be shared with the organization as a whole. And we identified that tribal knowledge is is a key driver behind compounding administrative debt. So
Hmm.
it is a way of addressing that tribal knowledge piece while identifying opportunities to reduce operational touch points for leadership as well.
Yeah, you think about, I mean, being an accounting firm, obviously we are high on documentation. That is our thing. And we always say have a file audit proof, right? That's our saying when we're dealing with our clientele. However, when we're dealing with our internal operations, it's actually just as important. It's very easy for customer service and different things to have documentation and the files and contracts and make sure you have your contract signed with your customers and et cetera. Those are primary. Although I know industries that they don't do it as much as they should, and and that's fine, but it depends on what level of risk you dictate that to be. And if it's a low risk, okay, if that seems to be a low risk, then you take that. But contracts, for instance, those are liability protection, they're payment protection, there's so much protection for your organization that if you don't do it, what's going to happen? But then when you're looking at the administrative side, like you said, Jasmine, eh, realizing where those processes are and identifying the departments that need to be prioritized, that's really where you have to think about it, because if you're not stepping back and going internal, it's much easier, I think, for us to be external and understand what needs to happen and focus on client and customer satisfaction and ensure our processes are in place there. But when we're looking at our internal stuff and understanding, how is the current practices working and what are we doing and why are we doing it, it's not always intuitive, I guess, when you get stuck in the that's how we do it pattern, and it can be quite detrimental to the bottom line of an organization. And look, most businesses, entrepreneurs are in the business for the bottom line. The top line is great, but if the middle component is not kept under control, the top line doesn't matter because you'll just spend every dollar you make. And unless you're a not-for-profit, even in those, you want to accumulate some stuff for capital, right? So you really have to step out and go, what are we doing internal that's hindering that bottom line?
That's a very interesting point. I love how you mentioned contracts. That's also one of my key items that I like to work with organizations on. So, when you understand administrative law, so just a little tidbit here for the group that's attending today. Once you have contract A, which is you have your offer acceptance consideration. Doesn't have to be in a paper format. It could actually be verbal. That is actually called contract A. You were actually unable to influence that once you enter into it. So does it make sense for your leadership or your executives to be approving everything after you have contract A? You can't go outside of that contract. So where's the value in them signing off on the invoice, in them signing off on the payment when they've already signed off on the contractual commitment? And I see that quite frequently in organizations. It's almost this fear of, if I don't see it and I don't touch it and I don't sign it, it might be wrong.
Yeah,
And at some point, decisions have to be made, or you got to get out of that operations and focus on that vision.
that's right.
We have a polling question next here, and it's a little bit of we're actually going to talk about it after. So we're just going to get your feedback before we actually start talking about automation. And so, from your perspective, what is the biggest barrier an organization faces in adopting automation solutions? Is it lack of budget resources, resistance to change? And I would say it goes beyond from staff, but from the organization as a whole. Incompatible or outdated systems, so there's no interfaces, unclear return on investment or value proposition, or all of the above. So, from your organizational perspective, we haven't had a chance to talk about it yet, but we're very curious within your organization, which one of these would apply to you? And is it all of the above? And I'm wondering if, as we move forward, if that will change in, say, 2 years' time, the perspective on this. I do feel we're sort of at this precipice of this automation and of AI, and we're starting to understand that it is here to stay. I don't think it's going away.
Hmm.
Interesting. All of the above, I think, definitely wins that. Um, that
Yeah, I think, that's not surprising.
yeah.
That we hear that consistently, and with our partners over at Andersen Consulting, who do a lot of the implementation of automation, it's definitely something that we always hear on a consistent basis that, there's you just don't have the time nor the resources to implement something and put something in place. Resistance from staff, really, it's an interesting one because Jasmine brought up the change management. Generally, resistance to that is lack of change management. It's not that staff don't like this stuff, it's that they don't understand why, what it's going to mean for them. Or, Jasmine said it earlier, there's a fear of what happens to my job if this is automated, and that can create a lot of resistance. But there is a lot of advantages when you think about automation because, and we mentioned it earlier that not everything should be automated. There's a lot of things that can be automated, but when you think about what are we doing and why are we automating it, it's the main reasons that you try to automate something is reduction of human error. We are invaluable. We make mistakes. We are not perfect, nor is automation or AI. I mean, we've seen that AI is not perfect in our industry yet. It gives a lot of wrong advice, but it when you're focusing purely just on the automation and data entry and movement of information, this is something that can be done and reduce that human error. I think about when you use multiple systems, there's a lot of great stuff out there that can do report generation that used to be done manually in Excel. And if you don't have that formula exactly just right every time, because you have to do it manually every single time, you reduce or you increase your risk of error. It also obviously increases speed and efficiencies. By putting in automation, you're no longer, humans have a finite amount of time, they have a finite amount of mind power, and they have a finite amount of energy. Automation is infinite. It can just keep going. And so when the systems are there kind of pumping, that allows for things to happen, and you don't need to worry about the brain getting tired and making mistakes because the systems don't get tired. And really, actually, the biggest advantage, in my opinion, is that we as humans can use our critical thinking, adding value to situations. We are the creative ones. We are the ones that can really look at something and decipher A or B. Not to say AI won't get there eventually. It's learning really fast. But it is something that we bring to the table that that's where our energy should be focused, is on that value added, critical thinking, visionary focused, creative work that we can do. And it really just is, how do we improve our production? Machines are, they've been advancing over the years. You think all the way back to the light bulb, right? Like we have created things in society and in the world that has allowed us to advance and move faster. And that's what automation does, is it just allows systems to work behind the scenes and really reduce the amount of error and the amount of time that we need to spend where we could be spending our energy elsewhere.
We have a couple questions, Krista, so I'll just
Sure.
read them out. Or would you-
Sure, we'll do it at the end.
Okay.
Yeah. Areas that we think are fairly suitable for easier, I should say, not easy, easier adoption of automation, things like invoicing. If a system can automate the invoicing, that means your accounts receivables automated, like the reminders, pay your bill, come out automatically. Having an individual, eventually, if someone's not paying an invoice, there is benefit to someone picking up the phone and saying, hey, noticed you haven't paid. However, the initial follow-ups and attempts should all be automated, and you should allow the system to do that. And same with payables and expense management. There's systems out there where it can go from A to E with only 2 steps and not have multiple steps in between to have expenses paid or invoices paid. There's great systems out there that automate that now, and actually there is systems that can scan the receipts and even code them for your financial statements and import it right into your financial statements. And so if you're not kind of looking through that stuff to get from A to E, meaning from inception of expense to an expense in your financial statements, before you had to do all of those 5 steps. If you can do it in 2 or 3 steps, you're now reducing your administrative debt in implementing that. Document routing and approval. Again, there's lots of systems out there now where it's more of a click of a button instead of having to go in and stamp a PDF or actually writing on a piece of paper a signature that then needs to be scanned back into a system. There's lots of document routing systems out there now that allow for approvals to happen. And finally, just reporting and dashboards. I talked about that on the last slide. There's, Power BI is a really big one where it can read the data of many different databases and create quite good reports. I was blown away. I'm techie, but not technological. And how much that real-time data that before had to be done on Excel consistently by a human is now just like this. And I can go in any minute and look at the reports and get the reports that I want. For someone who's loves data and loves to analyze data. It's very, I don't know, it's good for me, but it might be bad because I'm also now analyzing the data more. But it's good because we can catch trends early. And that's really what you need to do when you're trying to look at all these automations with invoice receivables, payables, reports, is to try and catch information so that you can understand even more systems to understand then how you can change your administrative debt going forward. And finally, choosing the right tools. Um, this one's an interesting one because there are so many systems out there right now. Um, it's sometimes really difficult to step back and say, what is this system going to do for me? Why am I switching to it or adopting it? And is it going to save us time in the future? It might save time today. And I've seen over and over again systems being looked at and implemented for something of a today need, but it's not going to be a need in 5 years. And it takes a lot of resources to get systems put in place. It's a lot internally as well as external consultants who come in and help with data transfer and data input and reconfiguration of the systems to match what you need. And I think I am not a systems expert. We have our consulting partners who do a lot of that work for us. And I think when I see what they're doing with their clientele, it's really stepping back and going, what is your future need? Because that system might be good for today, but is it really going to be good for your organization in 5 years if you're growing? Can it be scalable? How easily is the data inputted and exported? How easily can it be adopted within the system? And how easy is it to use? Can you train your team members quickly? Are they able to adapt and adjust to the new system? Or is it really cumbersome and you actually need to be a computer programmer to use the system because it's so much behind the scenes input that you don't really, it's not intuitive, I guess, if you will. Also,
And
it's
I think,
integration. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, beyond the usability piece of it, you also need to have the ability to adjust your processes. So I'm going to go back to that. You want to remain as customized off the shelf as possible. When you start customization, that's when you run into either, and this is a question, kind of the technical debt piece, as well as, you're not necessarily solving your problem because your technology becomes outdated so quickly. And once you start customizing, you're now increasing your costs as you go forward. And I think that should also, I recommend that to be a consideration as well, is what is the longevity of the software? Because that's also another factor is if they're a going concern, you run the risk of buying redundant and outdated software that you'll never be able to use again. And then you have no option but to switch. So it's
Yeah,
always good to look at the reputation of the software as well.
you brought up a good point about customization because anytime you have to overly customize a tool, did you first start with process mapping and saying, why are we customizing something? Is it important? Is it adding value? Is it going to be used in 3 years' time? And if the answer to all those questions are no, why are you spending the resources and the energy customizing for something that won't be used? Because
And
that's how you've
infiltrating the
done
change
it. Huh?
and, and bringing the change to the
That's
organization.
right. Yeah. Change is going to happen. I love the phrase. I actually don't like the use word change because change has an inherent negative connotation to it, meaning you're giving something up. I prefer whenever I'm working with my clientele is how are you evolving? How are you evolving your systems? How are you evolving your processes? How are you moving forward? And when you kind of switch the mindset into that, it brings less fear that you have to give something up and more, how are we evolving? How are we leveling up? How are we adding more? To the systems, not more processes, but more value to the systems that's when you start to really get into that mind shift, then you're probably gonna find less things are being customized because it's not actually adding value to the greater good of the organization and the vision. And if you really need to understand that, what is our future vision? And once you've got that kind of locked down, every decision that you're going to make and empower individuals to make, they should also be using that when they're looking at implementing something. And so we'll head over. I think that's about it for the webinar. I know that there are some questions, as you said. Um, I just want to remind everybody, please do complete the survey when you receive it. Let us know if there's future topics you'd like us to discuss within our enterprise advisory group. We do a lot of the fractional CFO, fractional CEO. Webinar is highly focused on that fractional CFO work. And if there's any other areas that you'd like to see us cover, please do let us know. So for the questions, the first question, as you evaluate administrative processes, how do you prioritize which process to streamline first, especially when multiple areas show inefficiencies? Do you rely more on the cost data, stakeholder input, or strategic alignment?
I would say when you're dealing with an organization that has multiple inefficiencies, you have to look at risk. What is going to impact that cash? And I know, Krista, you talked about it. Cash is king when you're running a business. So what really is impacting that cash? Um, Start there. Because at the
Yeah.
end of the day, if you have a process that is costing you a lot of money, you're going to see it on your cash side. And that's where you start. To me, that would be from an
Yeah, I
organization
agree. I think
perspective.
to take one step back in that you actually have to decide what's your risk right now,
Yeah,
right? Is cash low? If cash is low, let's focus on things where we can improve cash. If it's you're having a lot of customers, uh,
client retention.
customer dissatisfaction. Okay, what's happening in our processes? Because we can't keep losing customers. What's happening in our processes right now that are that's the highest risk for us? And so we've said it a couple of times. One of the biggest things is you have to figure out what the vision is of the organization. And then from there, also where are your biggest roadblocks and risks happening? And if there's something that is overriding another, like you have cash, you don't really have a cash problem, but you're losing a lot of customers, you will have a cash problem. So you better figure out why are you losing customers or employees or you've been trying to get something through and approved for 6 months and it can't get approved. Okay, it's time to step back and say what's taking so long to get this approved because we're now causing ourselves harm. So it's going to vary by organization, but it's really identifying that vision. What are your high risk areas and where is your biggest roadblocks currently that you need to, and you do have to go through them one by one.
Can you
uh,
explain? Oh,
oh,
where did
who
that
in the
question go?
organization should own the responsibility for monitoring administrative debt, and how do you hold them accountable when it's accumulating
We,
within an organization?
sorry, we have another question that was before that.
Oh, we'll go back to it.
Okay.
Yeah. How do you hold them accountable and measure the administrative debt? I would say everybody in the organization owns the responsibility and accountability uh, for administrative debt. Who's to measure it? Um, that's really going to depend on the type of organization that you're running as to who's going to be who's going to be owning the responsibility to monitor it. Generally, the finance department gets to see the financials consistently.
I would say, though, when you talk about owning and monitoring administrative debt, I would have to say that the onus is really on leadership. And the reason for that is because the team actually has no ability to move any changes forward without the support of leadership. I think it needs to be permeated throughout the organization, but that's an organizational culture.
Yeah.
And that tone is set at the top. And it's very difficult to influence culture from the bottom when the culture is much different at the top. And that's a very nuanced answer. Um, but everybody holds responsibility provided the culture is there within the organization. Everybody has to say, I don't know why I'm doing this. Do I still need to do it? And that is a really good question to filter up.
Yeah.
And management has to be receptive to that statement and say, okay, let's look at it. And I think,
And that's more what I meant by who's responsible for monitoring in everybody, because everybody can ask the question, why are we doing this?
yes,
And
100%.
if you really change your mind on what is administrative debt and it's kind of redundant processes, redundant steps, redundant approvals, simplified, that really can be anybody can be responsible for helping to monitor that.
And the other one is, can you explain how administrative debt differs from technical debt? And what are some early warning signs it is accumulating within an organization? So, for everybody here, technical debt is when you utilize a system that isn't going to serve your needs in a year or two, and you automatically know that it's going to become redundant. Um, Technical debt is actually part of administrative debt, but it's not the same. Technical debt is generally impacts your systems per se, whereas your administrative debt is your policies, processes. It's what leads to the bottlenecks. It is more encompassing than actual technical debt.
Awesome. And we just have one final question here. How can cross-department collaboration help identify and resolve resources of administrative debt more effectively?
Diversity of thought and perspectives helps ask the questions. Asking the question, why do we do this? It is just a really good way of helping remove that administrative debt piece.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jasmine, for presenting with me today. We're here on the hour. And if you have any further questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to us and we'd be happy to have a discussion. And again, please do fill out the survey once you repeat it for future topics or feedback that you have from us. Thank you very much for joining and have a great day.